January 29th, 1944, 8:43 hours, 26,000 feet over the Ruhr Valley. Oberleutnant Erich Kraft stared at the horizon from the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109G. His gloved fingers tightened around the control stick as he counted the glints of silver moving eastward in staggered formation, sunlight flashing off their wings like sequins sewn across the sky. They were B-17s, dozens of them. The Americans called it a combat box, tight, disciplined, ruthless in geometry. Each formation was a wall of steel and .50 caliber gunfire, crawling slowly but unstoppably toward German industry like a floating city of death. Kraft had seen this before. He defought them over Bremen Hamburg Castle. The playbook was the same. Rise high, dive fast, fire once and break away. Don't get caught in the kill zones. The B-17s didn't maneuver, but they didn't need to. Their strength was density, guns at every angle, overlapping arcs, enough to shred anything that lingered. He glanced left, 8 109s in his staffel, tight formation. Below them, 2 squadrons of FW-190s climbing to join. The order was clear: intercept the bombers before they reached Ludwigshafen's chemical plants. But something was wrong. Kraft narrowed his eyes. Shadows, tiny ones, not bombers, not big enough. Something underneath the B-17s flying tight, keeping pace. Then the radio snapped alive. New fighters below the bombers, unknown type. Repeat, unknown. They're staying with them. They're not breaking away. Kraft's blood went cold. The Americans never escorted that far. Thunderbolts didn't have the range. P-38s were rare this deep into Germany, but these were sleek. Long nose, bubble canopy, fast. At first, he thought they were British Spitfires. Then he saw the nose art, stars and bars, not roundels. And in that instant he knew the Americans had brought something new. He banked hard right, diving through vapor trails. As he descended, the shapes crystallized, not P-38s, not Thunderbolts, and definitely not Spitfires. These things moved like sharks. Thin fuselages, razor-straight wings, radiators tucked beneath their bellies like clenched fists. P-51 Mustangs. And they weren't escorting anymore. They were hunting. 3 of them broke formation and turned straight into the German interceptors, climbing into the sun like they didn't care who saw them. The climb angle was impossibly steep. Kraft blinked. He'd seen pilots try that in 109s. They stalled. But these Mustangs didn't stall. The first shots came from above, tracers lancing down, green to red. One of the FW-190s ahead of Kraft exploded mid-turn, wings shearing off in a ball of smoke. Kraft pulled hard into a roll, instincts kicking in. Behind him, the radio was chaos, voices shouting, overlapping, screaming. They're diving with us. How are they staying on? They're not Thunderbolts. Repeat, these are not. Break, break. One's on my tail, I can't. Static. Kraft pulled Hygie into a defensive spiral, engine howling. A shadow flickered past his canopy, a Mustang streaking by, engine whining like a banshee. It climbed vertically, rolled over, then dropped behind another BF-109 like it was tethered by wire. And then 8.50 cals lit up. The German fighter disintegrated. Kraft watched in horror. The Mustang didn't just win a turn. It didn't just fire a burst. It had complete positional control, like it had rewritten the rules of pursuit and engagement. He tried to climb again, tried to find altitude, but the sky no longer obeyed. The Mustangs were everywhere now, in pairs, in threes. Their tactics were disciplined, practiced. They didn't chase every German plane they picked, hunted, coordinated. And worst of all, they stayed. Hour after hour, wave after wave, the Mustangs never peeled off. They followed the bombers in. They escorted them out. They turned the very heart of Germany into a killing ground where no Luftwaffe fighter could hide and no altitude was safe. Kraft landed late that afternoon, his aircraft peppered with holes, fuel dangerously low. 2 of his staffel were gone, 2 more wounded. They downed a bomber, maybe 2, but at the cost of 5 fighters. And behind them, the Mustang pilots hadn't even broken formation. In the mess hall that night, someone whispered, "They've solved range." The word passed like a disease through the Luftwaffe. Range. That had been Germany's one edge. American fighters couldn't make it to central Germany. Bombers came alone. Germany bled, but it could still strike back, still shoot down B-17s over the fatherland. But the Mustang had erased that rule. With drop tanks slung under each wing, it flew from England to Berlin and back, escort all the way, dogfight all the way. The P-51 was not a short-range interceptor. It was not a compromised hybrid. It was a long-range, high-speed, high-altitude, fully capable fighter with better turn radius, better speed, and more punch than anything the Luftwaffe had faced. Oberleutnant Kraft sat in silence as the others murmured. Nobody spoke about the Mustang directly, but everyone knew. The Americans had not just brought a new aircraft. They had rewritten the sky. Tomorrow they'd come again. The bombers, the formations. But this time the Germans would be hunted before they even reached them. And somewhere above the clouds, behind every fortress, there'd be a P-51 waiting. It didn't matter how good you were. Because now, for the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe wasn't fighting bombers anymore. It was fighting America itself. The next morning, frost rimed the edges of Kraft's cockpit as his staffel climbed westward toward the Belgium border. The sun hadn't yet cleared the haze, and already vapor trails streaked the high sky, long, white scars stretching from the Channel into the heart of the Reich. Raid over Frankfurt, large formation, fortresses again, his radio operator had said at briefing, possibly over 500. Kraft had almost scoffed. 500. Nonsense. Until now, that number was theory, paper fantasy. But now, with every passing day, what was once impossible became the new routine. As he reached altitude, the reality formed around him. The bombers were there. Layer upon layer of B-17s. Dozens of formations, stacked, staggered, marching across the sky like iron continents. Kraft felt it in his chest, not fear exactly, but weight, as if he were facing not men but inevitability. His staffel was alone for now. Reinforcements would come, they always did, but time was short. If they didn't break the formation before the bombs fell, the result would be another cratered city. He keyed his radio. 1-3-5 break high, we draw fire, rest go in tight, dive fast, you get one pass. And they went. His engine roared as he nosed down, angling for the middle altitude stack. Flak bloomed ahead, black puffs near the fortresses, timed to burst but wide. Ineffective. He passed through it with a snarl, skimming the edge of the top formation just outside the kill zones. Then he dove. The silver wall loomed and every turret pivoted. .50 cal tracers streamed up like lasers, and for one glorious second he saw it, the belly of a B-17 unguarded. He lined up, fired a burst, saw rounds impact along the left wing route, and then the plane vanished behind smoke and flash. He didn't see if it fell, he didn't have time. He pulled out low, instinct dragging him into a spiral away from the formation. That's when the radio exploded. They're back. 12 o'clock high. 2 more, they're everywhere. Chase, he's on me, how is he? The Mustangs had arrived. And this time, they didn't wait for the bombers to be clear. Kraft rolled left, juked right, but it was too late. A silver blur screamed past, and a burst of tracers stitched the sky just behind his rudder. He dove for the clouds, throttle open, slipping the 109 into a tight arc, praying the Mustang would overshoot. It didn't. The Mustang matched him, through the clouds, into the dive, into the roll. It was faster, more agile at high speed, and worst of all, it didn't break off. No one told them to disengage, no fuel constraints, no radio recall. Kraft felt the bullets before he heard them. The cockpit shook, canopy spiderwebbed. Something hot grazed his thigh, smoke bled into the cabin. He yanked the stick up, threw the nose high. The Mustang didn't follow, not right away. He broke through the clouds, limping, engine sputtering. Another 109 fell past him in flames. The pilot didn't eject. And then he saw it. High above, contrails looping in wide arcs. Not just one Mustang, not 3, 10, maybe more. The American escort was no longer just a screen. It was a net. They were catching everything. He managed to limp back to base barely. The airfield was a skeleton now, fuel shortages, no spare engines. 2 aircraft crashed on landing. A third never made it back. Out of 9, only 4 returned. Later that day, Oberkommando der Luftwaffe held an emergency briefing. The consensus: the Americans had destroyed their buffer. The Mustang's range, especially with twin drop tanks, had erased Germany's last advantage. For the first time, the Luftwaffe couldn't choose when to fight. Now they were always fighting on their back foot, at altitude, on egress, even on the way home. And the Mustangs weren't flashy. They didn't dogfight for fun. They didn't chase kills recklessly. They eliminated. That week the kill ratios shifted catastrophically. Where once 3-1 had been a victory, now it was inverted. American losses shrank. German attrition skyrocketed. Veteran pilots were dying. And worse, their replacements didn't stand a chance. The P-51s had begun flying ahead of bomber formations. Offensive sweeps, not just protection, pursuit. Mustang squadrons cut into airfields, stalked fuel convoys, shredded parked aircraft before they left the ground. They no longer just defended the fortresses. They projected dominance. Kraft began to recognize names. Red-nosed squadrons from the 4th Fighter Group, black-tailed units from the 332nd, the bald eagles from the 354th. These weren't rookies. These were killers, fast, disciplined, coordinated. They came in high, split into pairs, flanked and boxed in German formations like herders corralling livestock. You couldn't outclimb them. You couldn't outdive them. And their guns, 8.50 calibers, shredded even the armored FW-190s in seconds. He stopped seeing them as fighters. They were executioners. By March, the airspace over central Germany belonged to them. The term began appearing in whispered barracks conversations: Mustang weather. It meant clear skies, long visibility, high-altitude sunlight, the kind of day the Reich had once claimed as its own. Now it meant run, hide, pray. The 109s and 190s still flew, but fewer returned. Fuel was tight, engines were old, and the men flying them were outmatched. One day, Kraft watched a rookie, a 20-year-old fresh from training, take off in a patched-up 109. He had 20 hours in the cockpit, no combat. 30 minutes later, a Mustang flew over the airfield low and slow and dropped the pilot's parachute on the runway. Empty. The message was clear. This was no longer a contest of aces and kills. No more romantic duels in the clouds. The war in the air had become a system, an equation, and the Mustang was the final variable. Because now America didn't need to win dogfights. They needed to keep bombers alive, and with the P-51 they did. The factories of Germany were dying under daylight bombardment, and for every B-17 that fell, 5 more got through. Kraft looked up one morning at a contrail stretching from horizon to horizon and realized it wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about the Luftwaffe or tactics or fighter design. The P-51 had changed the sky itself. The skies over Germany were supposed to belong to the Luftwaffe. For years, that had been doctrine, not just military strategy, but national pride. Messerschmitt aces had once ruled these altitudes with elegant violence. Their victories tallied like chess moves played across the clouds. The Reich had called it Luftüberlegenheit, air superiority. But in the spring of 1944, something shifted. The airspace over the German heartland had become occupied territory. Every morning began the same. The ground trembled with the distant roar of four-engine bombers. Contrails thickened into spiderwebs. Radar rooms lit up with frantic signals. Sirens wailed across runways as the Luftwaffe scrambled whatever they had, mostly understrength Gruppen, patchwork formations of veterans, rookies and men flying patched-up aircraft that hadn't seen a factory floor in a year. By now, every German pilot knew the rhythm. First the fortresses, then the fighters. But the fighters no longer vanished after Belgium. They didn't peel away near the Rhine. They came all the way in past Dusseldorf, past Kassel, past Leipzig, and circled high over Berlin like they owned it. The P-51 Mustang had changed everything. Oberleutnant Erich Kraft saw it firsthand during the March 6th raid on Berlin. It was the first time American bombers reached the capital in full daylight, escorted the entire way. At 27,000 feet, he locked eyes with a Mustang pilot for half a second before they rolled into mirrored spirals. That second was enough. The American had time to spot him, time to react, and time to counter, because he wasn't just flying escort. He was looking for a fight. They tangled for nearly a minute, loops and reversals, diving at breakneck speed through the thin, oxygen-starved stratosphere. But the Mustang never faltered. It climbed where the 109 groaned. It dove faster, leveled out sooner, retained energy in ways Kraft had never seen before. When he broke away, it wasn't out of victory. It was escape. He dove low, weaved through his own flak, and didn't stop until he was over tree line. Only then did the Mustang relent, not because it couldn't catch him, but because it didn't need to. That raid was a turning point. Berlin burned for hours. Entire blocks were flattened. The Reich Ministry of Aviation was hit directly. Command bunkers shook. Fires raged unchecked. But worse than the destruction was the loss of men. 8 Gruppen engaged the bombers that day. Only 4 returned intact. The others limped home or vanished entirely. German radar had tracked 800 bombers and over 700 fighters. That ratio was madness, nearly one escort coverage across hundreds of miles. Unheard of, impossible even. Except it had just happened. And it would happen again. Because now the Americans didn't have one Mustang group. They had dozens. Squadrons rotated through England like factory production lines, fresh pilots, fresh fuel, fresh engines. They were flying longer missions, deeper strikes, and coming home alive. The Mustang was no longer just a weapon. It was a doctrine. Some Luftwaffe squadrons began to change tactics. They avoided bomber formations entirely, targeting Mustangs first, but it made no difference. In one engagement near Münster, a group of FW-190s tried to ambush the fighters from above. Kraft was there, tucked into a cloud bank, watching the sky like a hawk. But the Mustangs saw them coming somehow. They climbed straight into the attack, broke formation by design, flanked, looped, and enveloped. 3 German fighters were gone in 20 seconds. The others fled in every direction. No bombers were touched. What shocked Kraft wasn't the firepower, it was the patience. The Mustangs didn't rush. They didn't get greedy. They fought with the discipline of machines, cold, precise, coordinated. They were no longer defending bombers. They were enforcing control. He watched it again and again. Mustang groups that never strayed from mission tempo, pairings that stayed locked even during chaotic dogfights, leaders calling brake left or extend down with perfect timing. American Fighter Command had cracked something, not just in performance, in training. They were flying as units, not lone wolves. No duels, no vanity, just results. And it worked. Each month, Luftwaffe numbers thinned. Not just planes, pilots, the irreplaceable ones. Men like Kurt Buchlejen, Günter Rahl, Walter Dahl, all wounded or forced to fly less. And the new pilots, barely trained, shoved into the cockpit of a 109 with fewer than 20 flight hours. Some had never fired a cannon before their first engagement. Kraft began to see a pattern. Mustangs didn't just attack formations. They singled out stragglers. They pounced on green pilots flying too wide, too slow, too low. And always the same result. By June, something strange began to happen. The bombers flew deeper, lower, more often, and fewer fighters scrambled to stop them. It wasn't just mechanical failure or fuel shortage. It was morale. Pilots began to fake engine trouble. They landed early, claimed oxygen failure, radio issues, anything. They didn't want to die. And the Mustangs didn't miss. One afternoon, a Mustang strafed a German airfield near Kassel. Kraft saw it from the ground, silver flash, low altitude, screaming between hangars like a scythe. It destroyed 2 parked fighters before anyone could react. No bombs, just .50 cal bursts and ruthless precision. And when it pulled up, it didn't run. It circled once, not out of arrogance, but to confirm the damage, and then vanished into the clouds. Kraft had once believed the Reich could hold the sky. Now he knew better. The Reich hadn't just lost air superiority. It had lost the ability to believe it could get it back. Because every time a German pilot climbed into the sky now, he didn't ask, "Will I find bombers?" He asked, "How many Mustangs will find me first?" And the answer increasingly was, "More than you can survive." The first time Oberleutnant Erich Kraft flew over Berlin and saw no flak, he knew the war was over. Not officially, not in ink or speech, but in truth. It was March 1945, and Germany's capital no longer defended itself from the sky. The anti-aircraft batteries had been moved to the front lines. The remaining fuel was being hoarded for tanks. Ammunition was rationed to the point of absurdity, and most of the Luftwaffe's interceptors, what few remained, sat grounded for lack of spare parts or pilots or both. The only thing that still arrived on time was the sound of Mustang engines. They came daily now in waves, not even with bombers often before. P-51s in groups of 4 or 6, flying low and fast, strafing rail yards, convoys, even civilian roads. It was no longer air superiority. It was occupation. The Mustang had become the vanguard of an airborne empire. Wherever it flew, the Reich retreated, not because the Germans lacked courage, but because they lacked the sky. Kraft had once flown in squadrons 30 strong. Now when he took off, it was in formations of 2, sometimes 3. The briefings were no longer about interception tactics. They were escape plans. If you see more than 4 Mustangs, don't engage. If they're above you, dive and run. If they have drop tanks, abort entirely. It was written into doctrine, official orders acknowledged, institutionalized. And still they flew. One morning, Kraft watched a new recruit, a boy who looked 16, climb into a refurbished WW190. The canopy barely closed over his helmet. He was airborne for 11 minutes. They never found the body. The Mustang had removed skill from the equation. It didn't matter how brave you were. It didn't matter if you could outturn someone in a 109 or dive faster in a 190. The American pilots weren't just flying better planes. They were flying with the weight of a nation behind them. Unlimited fuel, unlimited ammo, unlimited replacements. Kraft could still remember the first time he encountered one. The way it climbed, the way it turned inside his arc, the way it fired with such terrifying stability. But now it was worse. Because now the Mustangs weren't just winning, they were everywhere. They flew with names painted on the nose: Miss Miami, Hell's Angel, Apache Princess. Some had checkerboard noses. Others had solid red tails: Tuskegee pilots, the African-American squadron that shattered every preconception the Luftwaffe had ever held about their enemies. And each time they came, something else disappeared. A train, a convoy, a column of retreating infantry. Sometimes they didn't even shoot. They just circled, watching, denying airspace, asserting dominance. Even when the Germans weren't flying, they still couldn't move. The war on the ground began to grind into paralysis, not because of tanks or artillery, but because the sky was closed. And every German soldier who looked up knew exactly what was coming. By April, there were stories of infantry units surrendering at the sound of Mustangs overhead. No contact, no shots, just the unmistakable scream of a Merlin engine descending from the clouds. At the command level, the desperation grew. Goering, once so confident in the Reich's invincible Luftwaffe, was now screaming in meetings, blaming everyone but himself. "We need jet squadrons," he cried. The Me-262 was rushed to the front. In theory, it was faster, deadlier, revolutionary. In practice, it was too late. The jet engines were fragile, the runways too exposed, and the moment a 262 tried to take off, a swarm of Mustangs would dive in from altitude and chew it to pieces before the wheels even left the ground. The Mustang wasn't just a match for Germany's best. It was the reason Germany's best never had a chance. Kraft flew one of the last combat missions over western Germany in late April near the Elbe River. The order was simple: intercept anything moving east, enemy recon aircraft, spotter planes, even balloons. But they never reached altitude. 4 Mustangs were already overhead, orbiting at 30,000 feet. Within minutes, 2 of the German fighters were gone. The third tried to flee and was gunned down low over a wheat field. Kraft escaped, barely flying below treetop level for almost an hour, engine coughing black smoke. When he landed, there was no fuel left to refuel him. That was his final sortie. The next day, the airfield was hit by artillery. The day after that, they surrendered. He spent the final weeks of the war in a makeshift hospital near Leipzig, watching streams of American aircraft fly overhead like clockwork. Bombers, Mustangs, transports. None of them were afraid. None of them hurried. They moved like owners, not visitors. And in that silence, Erich Kraft understood what few commanders ever had the honesty to say out loud. The P-51 Mustang had not just changed the course of the war in the air. It had ended it. Because it wasn't about kills, it wasn't about dogfights, it wasn't even about range. It was about permanence. The Mustang stayed. It loitered. It hunted. It patrolled. It escorted. It followed you home. It erased the idea that the Luftwaffe could ever rise again. In May 1945, the sky over Bavaria was quiet. The vapor trails were gone. The thunder of engines had ceased. The only sound now was the wind over ruined airstrips and the boots of surrendering troops marching toward American checkpoints. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Third Reich, no longer existed. It hadn't been disbanded. It had been erased. And in every place where its remnants gathered, barns, cellars, schoolhouses converted into makeshift command posts, one name was spoken in resignation, not rage. Mustang. The Allies had swept across the continent with Sherman tanks and olive-drab infantry, but the first American soldiers the German people ever saw were in the sky. The P-51 had arrived first, always, months before the front lines. It became the shape of inevitability. silver wings cutting silently across the sun, a glinting crucifix for a Reich in freefall. Oberleutnant Erich Kraft stood outside a collapsed hangar outside Munich, arms folded across his chest, watching a pair of Mustangs fly over at low altitude. He didn't flinch anymore. Nobody did. The sound was familiar now, not terrifying, not even surprising, just final. They didn't fire. They didn't even maneuver. They simply flew over what used to be one of Germany's largest flight schools, a field now littered with burned-out 109s and scattered propeller blades. Kraft had taken off from this runway 2 years ago in a brand-new Gustav. He had trained here. He once believed truly that Germany had the best pilots, the best aircraft, the best engineers. He'd seen men like Marseille, Galland, Nowotny, and believed that German steel could shape the sky. But steel had limits. And the Americans didn't fight with steel. They fought with logistics, with fuel, with 1,000 Mustangs to replace every one shot down. He remembered the day he realized the war was lost, not when Berlin was bombed, not when Goering vanished from command, not even when the Soviets crossed the Oder. It was the day he climbed above the clouds and saw a line of B-17s stretching from the horizon to horizon, and every single one had a Mustang riding above it. He'd radioed his wingman and said simply, "We're not fighting bombers anymore. We're fighting time." And time had run out. At the makeshift POW camp where he was processed, a young American lieutenant approached, clipboard in hand. "You flew?" the American asked, scanning his collar tabs. "What unit?" "Jagdschwader 3, Kraft said. "Mostly 109s, few 190s. The American nodded. "I'm a Mustang guy." Kraft hesitated, then said, "I know." They stood in silence for a moment. No anger, no bravado, just mutual exhaustion. "How many did you shoot down?" the American asked finally. Kraft shrugged. 6 bombers, 8 fighters, I think you." The American smiled faintly. 3 190s, 1 jet, and a whole lot of trains. They shook hands, not in camaraderie, but in finality. Later, as Kraft sat in the dirt near a barbed wire fence, he watched the Mustangs again. They circled above like sentinels, silhouetted against the fading gold of a spring sunset. They weren't flashy, they weren't loud. They just stayed. That was the difference. The P-51 didn't win because it was the fastest, though it often was. It didn't win because it had the most guns, though it had enough. It won because it stayed. Over Schweinfurt, over Berlin, over Ploiesti. Over rail yards and oil fields, over airfields and convoys. Over hope, over retreat, over surrender. The Germans had built weapons. The Americans had built presence. The Mustang didn't just escort bombers, it escorted the future. And when the Reich finally fell, it wasn't to a single battle, or a single bomb, or a single decision. It fell to attrition, to exhaustion, to inevitability. And in the end, it fell under the shadow of a silver plane with a bubble canopy, a roaring Merlin engine, and 8 guns that spoke with calm authority. Erich Kraft would live to see peace. He would never fly again. But every time he looked skyward and heard that engine note, even decades later during air shows or in American documentaries dubbed into German, he felt it all over again. Not fear, not hatred. Just understanding. Because the day the Mustang first appeared wasn't just the day the Luftwaffe lost the advantage. It was the day Germany lost the sky. And no one ever got it back. The war had ended, but the sky never quite went back to silence. In the summer of 1946, 1 year after the surrender, Erich Kraft stood on the edge of an empty meadow outside Regensburg, watching a contrail fade into the blue. It was long, high, straight, the same signature he had learned to fear, then accept, then mourn. There was no more Luftwaffe. The insignia had been stripped from hangars, swastikas painted over, uniforms burned or hidden. The Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that hadn't been destroyed were being flown away by Americans or scrapped in place, wings removed, frames broken, history dismembered piece by piece. But the Mustangs remained. Now they flew patrols over the occupation zones. They escorted diplomats and generals. They performed flyovers at surrender ceremonies and base transitions. The same fighters that once hunted him from cloud to cloud now glided gently over German cities, engines quieter, purpose transformed. And yet when Kraft heard them, his breath still caught. Even now, when he had nothing left to defend, no orders to obey, no comrades to watch the horizon with, he still flinched at that sound, the growl of a Merlin engine at high throttle, unmistakable, unchanged. He wasn't alone. In Dresden, old pilots gathered in cellars and whispered of the raids, of the dogfights, of the day the sky went silver. Some cursed, others nodded in quiet resignation. All remembered. In Stuttgart, a mechanic who had once serviced FW190s now worked in a motor pool for American trucks. When he saw a Mustang fly overhead, he would pause and look up, not in hatred, but in awe. "I've never seen anything more perfect in the air," he once said, "and I've seen everything." The P-51 had not just ended the war, it had outlived it. Even in America, it had already become myth. In Kansas hangars and Ohio farm fields, demobilized Mustangs were sold as surplus. Veterans bought them cheap, repainted them, flew them across country highways for weekend sport. A machine built to kill now danced in blue skies over cattle ranches and cornfields. Pilots who had once fought in Europe now brought their sons up into the cockpit, letting them grip the stick and feel the tremble of flight. For them, the war was over, but the machine, the instrument that had given them the edge, the rhythm, the reach, lived on. At Langley, Wright-Patterson, and other American air bases, instructors gave lectures not on tactics, but on principles, why the Mustang had worked when others hadn't. It wasn't speed, one colonel explained. Not just that, it was balance. Climb, roll, dive, firepower, visibility, range, everything in harmony. That's how you control the sky. It became doctrine, blueprint, foundation. The F-86 Sabre that would fight in Korea carried its silhouette. The F-100 Super Sabre, the F-4 Phantom, the F-15 Eagle, each a descendant in shape or spirit. The sky had changed, and the P-51 had redrawn the borders. In Berlin, at a post-war Allied airfield, a disarmed Mustang was left on static display for a time, its machine guns removed, its nose art untouched, Marie's lullaby. It was chipped, sun-faded, and surrounded by children who tossed stones at its tail for fun. One afternoon, an elderly German man approached, hands behind his back, and stared at it for a long while. Finally, he said to the American guard, in English, "This one was always above me. I never saw it from the side like this. It's smaller than I imagined." The guard shrugged. "They always look small when they're not chasing you." The man nodded. "Yes, but not weaker." Kraft, for his part, never spoke publicly of his time in the war. He found work as a draftsman. Later, he taught mathematics at a school rebuilt from bricks salvaged out of rubble. But each time he drew the parabola of a projectile on the blackboard. Each time he explained drag, lift, and escape velocity. He felt it, that silver shape overhead, glinting, banking, lining up for another pass. He never saw it again in combat, but in dreams it never left. Even decades later, when American F-16s roared over West German air bases during NATO exercises, it was never the noise that startled him. It was the quiet sound before. The moment when all you could hear was your own breath. And then the Mustang would come, not from ahead, but behind, just over the shoulder, with that perfect shriek of acceleration. And everything you knew, all your training, all your instincts would vanish. Because it wasn't just the fear of dying. It was the knowledge that you had already lost before you climbed into the cockpit. That was what the Mustang had done. Not just to him, to all of them. It had taken the sky. And then it had stayed. In 1951, Erich Kraft stood on a concrete tarmac in West Germany and watched the same silhouette that had once haunted him settle gently onto the runway. A P-51D Mustang, polished to mirror shine, its red nose painted in the colors of a U.S. Air Force training squadron stationed at Landsberg. It was a training day, nothing more, but it didn't feel like that. The war had ended 6 years earlier, but for men like Kraft, time didn't draw clean lines. The sky still echoed with old sounds. The smell of fuel, the sting of wind off the wings, the whistle of a Merlin engine on approach, none of it had aged. It had merely waited. The Mustang rolled to a stop. A young American stepped out, barely 20, flight suit half-zipped, laughing with his ground crew. He didn't look like someone who knew what this aircraft once meant. He hadn't seen what it had done. But then Kraft thought perhaps that was the point. The war had made ghosts, the peace had made myths. And the Mustang had become both. In the years after the war, the P-51 was sold, displayed, honored, and flown across the world. Countries that had once feared it now flew it. It became a first-line fighter for over 50 nations. In Korea, it hunted MiGs over frozen ridges. In Israel, it flew in defense of a new state. In Central America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, the Mustang served everywhere, long after its creators had moved on to jets. But to Kraft, and to others who had once looked up in dread, the shape was eternal. In 1957, he attended a NATO air demonstration outside Wiesbaden. Jet engines roared over the runway, sabers, hunters, early French misters, sleek and futuristic, with speed the old warbirds could never imagine. And then the announcer's voice crackled in English and German. "Please direct your attention skyward. You'll recognize this one." The crowd turned. It appeared from the east, low, fast, shimmering in silver and yellow. The Mustang came in over the trees like a memory returning from exile. It leveled out, climbed into a long loop, rolled, then dove straight down the runway with a howl that belonged to another century. The crowd cheered, even the children, especially the children. They didn't know what it had done, only that it had once mattered. Kraft didn't cheer, he didn't clap. But he stood. He wasn't angry, he wasn't mourning, he wasn't anything that could be measured in wartime terms. He was remembering the moment, the precise moment, when the world had changed. It wasn't the atomic bomb, it wasn't the Normandy landings, it wasn't even the surrender. It was that day, high over the Ruhr Valley, when the first Mustang slipped in under the B-17s and turned east. The day the Luftwaffe realized their map had become obsolete. The day the airspace above their own soil was no longer theirs. The day the Americans stopped reaching for victory and began escorting it all the way to Berlin and back. It had started with a silhouette, a new shape, a long nose, a belly scoop, something faster, something patient, something permanent. Kraft once believed it was just another aircraft, just a new number in the registry. But the P-51 had done something no other plane ever had. It stayed. Every other fighter in history had range or speed or firepower. The Mustang had all three and time. Time to fight, time to wait, time to come back. And even now, decades later, long after the Reich had collapsed and the world had drawn new lines across the maps, Kraft still found himself looking up at contrails and listening for that sound. It wasn't just noise. It was a memory, a warning, a lesson. Because once, for a moment in history, a machine had changed the very idea of distance, had turned defense into dominance, had crossed the line between reach and rule. And when it did, everything below, every command, every doctrine, every assumption began to fall. The Mustang didn't end the war alone, but it ended the Luftwaffe's claim to the sky. And no one ever took it back.